Thank you very much for your most charming introduction. I hope to live up to it. Effectively, I was invited by Hernando in spring, in July of this year, to come here to talk to you about the relationship between law and economic development. At that time, one of the growing concerns was we had globalization. We were growing like never before. Between 1948 and spring 2008, the world has grown more than in the previous 2,000 years. So it's a time to feel good. But at the same time, we know through the figures we have been obtaining at the Commission for the Legal Empowerment of the Poor that about 4 billion people have been left behind. In other words, it's not that they're not doing well, it's just that they're not doing as well as the rest. And wealth is a very comparative phenomenon. And so the idea was you've got to empower them because, and that was what I was supposed to talk to you about, we feel that those that aren't legally empowered do not have the tools with which to survive in a global economy. A global economy means dealing with people that you never see, that you don't know. It's about anonymity. And so what brings people together is the thesis that I hold and that the Commission holds requires the law, because it's the law that represents you in documents. It's through law and legal documents that you're able to identify facts, that you're able to identify risks. And I felt at that time that it was time to explain that in Latin America, those who, in spite of increasing prosperity, do not feel that they are represented in the global economy are the kind of people that today, in my country, in various countries in Central America, South America, basically vote against the system because they feel that they're not part of it. So what I was going to do was try and demonstrate that one of the big problems that we face is that poverty is seen essentially as a cultural and economic failing. Well, what I was going to present to you is that it is rather principally a problem pertaining to property law or law. That the biggest factor that keeps people behind today is the lack of legal instruments. But then, of course, since July, we're now in October, a few months later, there's no way to not recognize the fact that we've got now not only a front against globalization among the poor of the world that increases, that you can see it taking shape in the Middle East, that you can see it taking shape in Central Asia, that you can see it taking shape in Latin America, but you also have the fact that globalization is now going to be under severe attack, also in the wealthy countries. And so I'm adding that to today's remarks, because I also feel there that what is seen essentially as a great credit contraction, as essentially a liquidity and risk pricing issue, which is what the subprime crisis is labeled as, is also essentially a legal problem. So I will even start off by defining developing countries, countries like mine, Peru, which is where I come from, as countries that are in a chronic subprime crisis. In other words, the West is now being hit by something which we all hope will be just passing, but I'm saying that developing countries that have 4 billion of the world's people on the poor side are chronic subprime crisis. And I want to explain that. And it has very much to do with something that Martin Soto was talking to us about. He said, talking to you lawyers and you jurists, we are about connections. And I think that that's very important because you see, property and the law about property seen by an economist, I'm not a jurist, I always thought I made a mistake by not studying that because that's what today interests me. But I think property has more to do with general connections than it has to do with the asset itself. For example, I brought today here with me an Argentine apple. This is my apple. This is Hernando's apple. Now, this is a physical apple, but no matter how you look at that apple, no matter how, if you cut it open, even if I tell you who gave it to me and why it's mine, nothing in this apple says how this apple connects in the commercial world. There's nothing in the apple that says I own it. An apple that is stolen looks exactly like a legal apple. Whether I own it, I sell it, I buy it. I transfer it, I loan it, I lease it, I rent it, I pledge it, I collateralize it, I mortgage it. I use it as a point of collection. I limited the liability on this apple. I give it in succession. Whatever I do with it, none of that is in the apple. It's all in the law. So property basically is a system that doesn't talk to us so much about the asset itself, but how it connects. And things are very much how things are connected. The trouble about connections, as opposed to apples, is that they're invisible. How do you touch and see a connection? How do you see a relationship? And you can't unless you look at property law. So, for example, I am about the result of 30 million cells, células. And I can come in and say to you, I'm Hernando de Soto, 30 million cells. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting to identify me is not what I'm composed of physically, but how these cells relate to each other. That would be my DNA. So we are all made up of physical things that are related to each other in a certain way. But while we can see the physical thing, we can't see the relational thing. And the relational thing is strictly something that you can see in law, and it's in a property paper. So that is what allows the whole economy to move. You get credit because it comes from the Latin word credere. Credit means I believe you. I believe you because you have something to lose. Without credit, without an apple, without an asset, you don't get credit. And when you don't have one, then you get a subprime crisis. Capital is something that is not money. Capital has to do with value. In Peru, for example, we took the Peruvian telephone company, Compañía Peruana de Teléfonos, which was worth $53 million on the stock market, and we redesigned the property law so that everybody abroad, Englishmen, Americans, Japanese, Chinese, could understand the company, and it was